The day my grandfather's will was read started like every other family gathering in our house, full of fake smiles, forced conversations, and the quiet understanding that my younger brother Ethan was always the center of attention. Ever since we were kids, Dad treated him like the golden child. Ethan could do no wrong. If he made a mistake, it was excused. If he succeeded, it was celebrated for weeks. I spent years trying to earn the same praise, working harder, studying longer, and helping with Grandpa's business whenever I could. But no matter what I did, Dad always found a reason to compare me to Ethan. The only person who never made me feel second best was Grandpa. He believed in me when no one else did. He taught me how to solve problems, trusted me with responsibilities, and often told me that one day my hard work would be rewarded. Those words became my source of hope during the years when it felt like my own father barely saw me. When Grandpa passed away, the loss hit me harder than I expected. At the funeral, I stood quietly beside his grave while relatives shared stories about his kindness and wisdom. Ethan spent most of the day accepting condolences like he was already stepping into Grandpa's role. Dad remained composed, shaking hands and acting like the future of the family was already settled. Something about his confidence bothered me, but I ignored it. I believed Grandpa had always valued fairness. Whatever was written in his will, I trusted his judgment. A week later, the family gathered at the lawyer's office. The room was crowded with relatives, business partners, and family friends. I sat near the back, nervous but hopeful. I wasn't expecting a fortune. I simply wanted to know that Grandpa had remembered me the way I remembered him. The lawyer began reading the will, listing donations to charities, gifts to relatives, and instructions regarding various properties. Then the discussion shifted to the family business and the estate. The room grew silent. Before the lawyer could continue, Dad stood up. He straightened his jacket and smiled proudly at Ethan. "My father always knew who was best suited to carry on the family legacy," he announced. "Today, that responsibility officially belongs to Ethan." Several relatives immediately started clapping. Ethan smiled confidently as though he had been expecting this moment his entire life. My stomach tightened. The lawyer continued reading. According to the document, Ethan would receive control of the business, the largest portion of the estate, and several valuable properties. As for me, there was almost nothing. A small financial gift was all that remained beside my name. At first I thought there had been some mistake. I looked at the lawyer, waiting for clarification, but none came. The reading continued as if everything made perfect sense. Around me, family members congratulated Ethan. Some didn't even bother hiding their satisfaction. I felt the blood draining from my face. When the meeting ended, I approached Dad. "There has to be something wrong," I said quietly. "Grandpa talked to me about the future all the time." Dad's expression hardened. "You need to accept reality." "Reality?" I asked. "Grandpa spent years teaching me the business." "He taught both of you," Dad replied coldly, "but he knew Ethan was the better choice." The words hit harder than I expected, not because I believed them, but because they confirmed what I had always feared. Dad had never seen me as an equal. He wasn't just defending the will. He was enjoying my humiliation. Ethan walked over with a sympathetic smile that somehow made everything worse. "Don't take it personally," he said. "Grandpa just wanted what was best for the family." I stared at him in disbelief. He accepted everything without question because the outcome benefited him. Not once did he wonder whether it was fair. The celebration continued around me while I stood there feeling invisible. Years of loyalty, sacrifice, and effort had vanished in a single afternoon. The people I called family barely looked at me. Their attention remained fixed on the new heir. I left the office without saying goodbye. Outside, the afternoon sun felt strangely cold. Sitting alone in my car, I replayed every conversation I had ever shared with Grandpa. His encouragement, his trust, his belief in me. None of it matched what had happened inside that room, yet the evidence was undeniable. According to everyone else, Grandpa had chosen Ethan and left me behind. As I drove away, a painful realization settled into my heart. Losing Grandpa had already broken me, but learning that my own father had so easily erased my place in the family shattered something even deeper. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. I didn't know then that the story wasn't over. I didn't know that the truth had been carefully hidden. All I knew was that the family I had spent my entire life trying to please had just shown me exactly how little I meant to them. 3 months passed after the reading of the will, but the pain never truly faded. Every morning I woke up hoping the memories of that day would hurt a little less, yet they followed me everywhere. My relationship with my family had almost completely disappeared. Dad never called. Ethan occasionally sent short messages that felt more like obligations than genuine concern. Most of my relatives acted as though I no longer existed. The family gatherings I once attended continued without me, and photos posted online showed smiling faces, celebrating birthdays, business achievements, and holidays. Looking at them felt like staring through a window at a life I had been removed from. Financially, things became difficult. For years I had worked alongside Grandpa, believing I was helping build a future that would eventually include me. After the estate was settled, many of the opportunities I expected vanished overnight. The small amount left to me from the will helped for a while, but it wasn't enough to replace what I had lost. I moved into a modest apartment and took on extra work just to keep up with expenses. Some nights I sat alone at my kitchen table, wondering how everything had changed so quickly. What hurt the most wasn't the money. It was the feeling that Grandpa had somehow forgotten me. Every lesson he taught, every encouraging conversation, every promise that hard work mattered seemed impossible to reconcile with the contents of the will. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Grandpa wasn't a man who played favorites. He valued fairness above almost everything else. Even when Ethan and I were children, Grandpa always made sure we were treated equally. Yet somehow, according to the will, he had left nearly everything to Ethan. One afternoon, while having coffee near the old family business, I ran into Martin, a longtime employee who had worked for Grandpa for more than 20 years. He greeted me warmly and asked how I was doing. After a few minutes of conversation, his expression grew serious. "Your grandfather talked about you often before he passed," he said. I smiled sadly. I know we were close. Martin hesitated before continuing. "That's why none of this makes sense." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He glanced around carefully before lowering his voice. "The last few months of his life, he kept asking when you were coming to see him." I frowned. I visited whenever I could. Martin shook his head. "No, near the end. He specifically requested several meetings. He seemed frustrated because you never showed up." Confusion flooded through me. Nobody told me about any meetings. "I figured you knew," Martin replied. The conversation haunted me for days. Grandpa had requested meetings that I never heard about. How was that possible? At first I tried convincing myself there had been some misunderstanding, but the more I thought about it, the more questions surfaced. A week later, I decided to review old emails and messages. Buried among hundreds of notifications, I noticed something strange. Several messages from Grandpa's assistant appeared incomplete. Some referenced appointments and conversations that had never reached me. Others seemed to be missing entirely. It was as though pieces of communication had disappeared. The discovery left me unsettled. Soon after, I encountered another surprise. While sorting through old boxes from my childhood, I found a birthday card Grandpa had given me years earlier. Inside, he had written a note in his careful handwriting. "Never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on their approval. One day the truth always finds its way into the light." I read the sentence over and over. The following week, another unexpected encounter deepened my suspicions. I ran into Linda, a retired receptionist who had worked closely with Grandpa. When she learned I was no longer involved with the business, she looked genuinely shocked. "That's impossible," she said. "Your grandfather always talked about the two of you working together in the future." I felt my chest tighten. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," she replied. "He was proud of Ethan too, but whenever he discussed long-term plans, your name always came up." For the first time since the will reading, anger began replacing sadness. Something wasn't right. The official story claimed Grandpa had deliberately chosen Ethan as his sole successor, yet everyone who knew him best remembered a completely different vision. The people who spent years by his side spoke about fairness, partnership, and equal trust. Their memories didn't match the document that had changed my life. Then another strange detail emerged. Grandpa's longtime attorney, the man who had handled nearly every legal matter for decades, had retired suddenly just days after the estate was settled. No farewell gathering, no public announcement. He simply disappeared from professional life. The timing felt too convenient. Questions that had once seemed impossible to ask now demanded answers. Why had Grandpa tried to meet with me before his death? Why had messages gone missing? Why did trusted employees remember plans that completely contradicted the will? And why had key people vanished immediately after everything was finalized? Late one evening, I sat alone in my apartment staring at old photographs of Grandpa. Instead of grief, I felt determination growing inside me. For months I had accepted the story everyone handed me. I had convinced myself that Grandpa made a choice I didn't understand, but now doubt had taken root, and it refused to go away. Maybe Grandpa hadn't abandoned me. Maybe someone wanted me to believe he had. As rain tapped against the apartment window, I made a decision that would change everything. I would stop mourning the inheritance I lost and start searching for the truth behind it. Whatever secrets had been buried after Grandpa's death, I would uncover them. I owed that much to the man who had always believed in me. What I didn't know was that the answers were already moving toward me. And before long, a knock on my door would reveal a truth far bigger than anything I had imagined. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected lights and shadows. I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by old photographs, notes, and documents I had collected during my search for answers. Despite weeks of investigation, I still had more questions than evidence. Every clue seemed to point toward something hidden, yet nothing was solid enough to prove that Grandpa's estate had been manipulated. Frustration weighed heavily on me. I was beginning to wonder if I was chasing ghosts. Then, at exactly 8:30 that evening, someone knocked on my door. The sound startled me. I wasn't expecting visitors. Most people I knew called before stopping by, and very few people even knew where I lived. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, firm, deliberate, and patient. I opened the door cautiously. Standing outside was an older man in a dark coat. Rainwater dripped from his shoulders. His grey hair was neatly combed, and his serious eyes seemed to study me carefully. "Are you Daniel?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "My name is Samuel Reed. Your grandfather asked me to find you if certain things happened after his death." My heart immediately began racing. "What are you talking about?" "May I come in?" he asked. Every instinct told me to be careful, but something about his calm confidence made me step aside. Samuel entered the apartment and removed his coat. Once seated, he reached into a leather briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. I froze. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It belonged to Grandpa. My hands trembled as I stared at it. "I've waited months to deliver this," Samuel said quietly. "Your grandfather gave me very specific instructions." I looked at him in disbelief. "Who are you?" "For many years, I worked as a private investigator. Occasionally, your grandfather hired me when he needed independent verification of sensitive matters. About 6 months before his death, he became concerned about certain members of the family." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What kind of concerns?" Samuel leaned forward. He believed someone might attempt to interfere with his final wishes. The words sent chills through my body. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The moment I saw Grandpa's signature, tears filled my eyes. The letter began simply, "If you are reading this, something has gone wrong." I swallowed hard and continued. Grandpa explained that he had grown increasingly worried during his final months. Certain financial records had disappeared. Conversations were being interrupted. Documents he requested were delayed or altered. Most troubling of all, he had discovered attempts to isolate him from people he trusted. Including me. According to the letter, Grandpa had repeatedly asked for meetings with me because he wanted to discuss important changes to his estate. Yet each time he requested contact, excuses appeared. Messages supposedly went unanswered. Schedules mysteriously conflicted. "I never stopped believing in you," one sentence read. "If others tell you otherwise, they are not telling the truth." Tears rolled down my face. For months, I had carried the crushing belief that Grandpa had rejected me. Now I knew he hadn't. Samuel allowed me a few moments before opening his briefcase again. "This is only the beginning." From inside, he removed a small locked metal box. After entering a code, he opened it. The contents immediately caught my attention. There were legal documents, financial records, audio recordings, and several additional letters. "What is all this?" I asked. "Evidence," Samuel handed me a folder. Inside were copies of estate documents bearing different dates. As I examined them, one detail stood out immediately. A newer version existed. A version I had never seen. My pulse quickened. According to those papers, Grandpa had not left everything to Ethan. Instead, the estate was divided fairly. The family business ownership was split. Several valuable properties were assigned directly to me. I was also granted significant voting shares in the company, enough to prevent anyone from controlling it without my involvement. "This can't be real," I whispered. "It is real," Samuel replied. "The signatures have been authenticated, the documents were witnessed properly, everything was legally executed." I stared at the pages in shock. Then why wasn't this presented during the reading of the will? Samuel's expression darkened. Because someone made sure it wasn't. The answer I had feared finally stood in front of me. Dad. For months I had avoided fully accepting the possibility. Now the evidence forced me to confront it. Samuel then revealed the most devastating piece of information. Several weeks before Grandpa died, he had secretly recorded conversations after becoming suspicious. One recording contained a discussion involving Dad. Samuel played part of the audio. Although the voice sounded slightly distorted, there was no mistaking it. It was Dad. The conversation centered around estate control, company ownership, and concerns about Grandpa changing his plans. The recording stopped short of proving every detail, but it confirmed something critical. Dad knew Grandpa intended to update the inheritance structure. And he was unhappy about it. I sat in stunned silence. Everything suddenly made sense. The missing messages. The blocked meetings. The retired attorney. The inconsistent stories. The humiliation at the will reading. It had never been Grandpa's betrayal. It had been Dad's. For years I had blamed the wrong person. Grandpa had fought to protect me until the very end. Samuel handed me one final letter. "This was meant to be delivered when you learn the truth." I opened it carefully. Inside, Grandpa wrote about character, integrity, and perseverance. Then I reached the final paragraphs. "No matter what happens, do not become like those who hurt you. Justice matters. Truth matters, but never allow bitterness to become your inheritance. The greatest victory is building a life that no one can take from you." I read those words several times. For the first time since his death, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The pain was still there. The betrayal was real. But now I finally understood. Grandpa had never abandoned me. He had trusted me. And he had left behind everything I needed to uncover the truth. As the storm continued outside, I looked at the evidence spread across my table. The secret was no longer hidden. The lies were beginning to unravel. And the people who believed they had stolen my future were about to discover that Grandpa had prepared for their betrayal long before it happened. The fight for justice was only beginning, but for the first time, I knew I wasn't fighting alone. Grandpa's voice, preserved in his letters and plans, was still guiding me forward. The weeks that followed changed everything. What began as a painful search for answers quickly turned into a battle that shook my entire family. With Samuel's help, I delivered the hidden documents, recordings, and letters to a legal team specializing in estate disputes. They spent days examining every piece of evidence. When they finally finished, their conclusion was clear. There was enough proof to challenge the will that had been presented after Grandpa's death. The legal process moved slowly at first, but once the court reviewed the evidence, the situation escalated rapidly. The existence of a newer will immediately raised serious questions. Investigators examined signatures, witness statements, financial records, and communication logs. One by one, the pieces fell into place. Missing emails were recovered. Former employees came forward. Even individuals who had remained silent for months finally agreed to speak. As the truth emerged, the image Dad had carefully built over the years began to crumble. For so long, he had been respected as the leader of the family business and the loyal son carrying on Grandpa's legacy. But now people started seeing a very different picture. Evidence showed that he had controlled access to Grandpa during his final months. Several important messages had been intercepted. Meetings had been cancelled without Grandpa's knowledge. Key documents had mysteriously disappeared before the original estate hearing. The courtroom remained silent when those facts were presented. Dad sat at the defense table with a rigid expression, refusing to look in my direction. For the first time in my life, he looked afraid. The most surprising reaction came from Ethan. At first, he refused to believe any of it. He defended Dad publicly and insisted that there had to be an explanation. But as more evidence surfaced, his confidence faded. He listened to recordings. He read Grandpa's letters. He reviewed the legal documents himself. Eventually, he came to my apartment. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted. "I didn't know," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he lowered his eyes. "I thought Grandpa chose me." The sadness in his voice was genuine. For years, I had blamed Ethan for everything. Yet standing there, I realized he had been manipulated too. He had benefited from the deception, but he hadn't created it. "I know," I replied. His eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry." Those two words didn't erase the past, but they lifted a burden I had carried for a long time. A few months later, the court delivered its decision. The newer will was declared valid. Grandpa's actual wishes were finally recognized. Ownership of the estate was redistributed according to the authentic documents. The family business shares were corrected. The properties Grandpa intended for me were returned. Control of important company decisions could no longer be held by a single person. The courtroom erupted into whispers as the ruling was announced. Dad remained motionless. The man who had spent years controlling everyone around him had finally lost control. But the greatest surprise came afterward. Many people expected me to celebrate. Some assumed I would seek revenge the same way revenge had been used against me. Friends suggested lawsuits beyond the estate case. Others encouraged me to publicly humiliate Dad the way he had humiliated me. For a brief moment, the temptation existed. I remembered every insult, every comparison, every time I was told I wasn't good enough. Every moment I sat alone wondering why my own father couldn't love me the way he loved Ethan. Yet whenever anger threatened to take over, I remembered Grandpa's final letter. "Never allow bitterness to become your inheritance." Those words changed everything. Instead of focusing on punishment, I focused on rebuilding. Using the resources Grandpa had intended for me, I invested in the business's employees. Several workers who had been neglected under Dad's leadership received long overdue support. Community programs that Grandpa once funded were restored. Scholarships were created in his name. Charitable projects he cared about were expanded. People who had once viewed me as the forgotten child began seeing me differently. Not because I had won money. Because I chose integrity when I had every reason to choose resentment. Meanwhile, Dad's world continued shrinking. Business partners distanced themselves. Friends disappeared. Family members who once supported him questioned everything. The reputation he had spent decades building collapsed under the weight of his own choices. One evening, nearly a year after the court ruling, I visited Grandpa's grave. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the cemetery. I stood quietly beside the headstone and placed fresh flowers at its base. For several minutes I said nothing. Then I smiled. Not because I had defeated anyone. Not because I had recovered the inheritance. But because I finally understood what Grandpa had been trying to teach me all those years. The estate was never the true legacy. Character was. Money could be stolen. Property could be hidden. Documents could be manipulated. But integrity could not be taken away unless you surrendered it yourself. Dad spent his life chasing control and lost everything that truly mattered. Grandpa spent his life building trust, kindness, and respect, and his influence remained even after his death. As I stood there, I felt a sense of peace that no court ruling could ever provide. The lonely, heartbroken person who had walked out of the lawyer's office months earlier was gone. In their place stood someone stronger, wiser, and finally free from the need for approval. Before leaving, I touched Grandpa's headstone one final time. "Thank you," I whispered. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees. For the first time in a very long while, the future felt bright. My father had tried to erase me from Grandpa's legacy. Instead, his betrayal revealed exactly why Grandpa believed in me. And in the end, that became the sweetest revenge of all. I didn't just reclaim what was mine. I became the person Grandpa always knew I could be, while the people who underestimated me were left to face the consequences of their own choices. The stranger's knock had uncovered the truth, but it was my response to that truth that ultimately transformed my life forever.